Hello and welcome to the session, Interviews Asking the Right Questions. Every single VISTA project goes through the recruitment process, which of course includes interviewing certain applicants. And for you to learn about your applicants, one of the things you must do is have structured and strategic interview questions to prompt conversation and examples. When you ask the right questions in the interview, you encourage your applicants to respond with information that can help you and your project staff determine if they are a good fit for the position. My name is Eric Powell, and I'm a VISTA training specialist at AmeriCorps in Washington, D.C., where I currently train VISTA sponsors, supervisors, and members, along with improving and developing training materials and curriculum with the VISTA program. Having served as a VISTA member and a VISTA leader and a VISTA program coordinator, I've had a lot of work in dealing with interviews, which is one of my favorite things to work with. People are my passion. So I'm happy now to be on staff with the AmeriCorps VISTA headquarters team. In looking at today's agenda, we're going to explore a couple of things. First, planning ahead, briefly looking at the purpose and importance of interviews, which should be pretty obvious. Next, we're going to go through a mock interview, looking at a couple of snippets of an interview, asking a specific question, offering an answer, and then asking you to think about the details of that question, whether that's a good question, a bad question, or other to ask in an interview. Then we'll segue into briefly describing some questions that you may want to avoid asking in an interview, as well as questions to consider, or what are the right questions. We'll then end with some recommendations and tips, ask you to complete an evaluation of today's session, and we'll take time to answer some of your questions. So let's start with planning. Effective interviewing begins with planning ahead. Just like anything else, before you jump in, you want to strategize and think about creating a structure. We're not going to spend a lot of detail on this because I'm sure you've seen this image before. This is the AmeriCorps VISTA recruitment process. And I'll just mention that you know that you need to plan recruitment, market opportunity listings and positions, screen potential and actual applicants, interview applicants, select applicants you want to serve, and then if they are approved by the regional office, of course, you then need to onboard those members as they begin service. And the cycle continues as recruitment is often ongoing, especially for projects that have members starting at different times of the year. Today, we're going to specifically focus the conversation on the interview part of the recruitment process. You may or may not be familiar with something called Instructional Systems Design, or ISD, and the use of what is called ADDIE, A-D-D-I-E. People use this approach to create learning. In this example, you first analyze what information you have. Then, you design what you want it to look like based on that analysis and its layout before moving on to the stage of actually developing and creating it. Next, you implement it and put it to work, and then you evaluate it. Of course, you may be evaluating at various levels, but this same process, even in a simple form, can and very much should be used for interviews as you analyze the information about your VISTA project and the information that you have from the applicants who submitted applications to you. Then you actually design the interview process, including the layout, the structure of questions, and what you want it to look like. Finally, you begin to develop and create the actual questions, which enables you to implement this by actually asking the questions during the interview. And then the last step, you evaluate the process, as I'm sure many of you are already doing with your interviews, looking at how you can improve them, what you need to change, and what the next step in your process is. So that's a very high-level view of how you can use the ADDIE process for your interviewing. Because many of you may have already searched, or maybe you'll be searching later for additional information on interviews. We know that there's a ton of information on the internet. You can just Google interviews or search in any web browser for interviews and find a ton of information. And although the VISTA position is not a job nor employment, you can still get a good idea of things to avoid, to consider, and best practices for interviews, even though this is for a national service position and not a job. So today we'll focus on a couple of them in today's session as we look specifically through the lens of important questions you will ask your VISTA applicants. This should go without saying, but remember, each applicant who is applying to serve in AmeriCorps with the VISTA program is not applying for a job or an internship. We've heard people refer to them as interns or fellows or other things like that. Then they're also not employed by AmeriCorps, the VISTA program, or your sponsoring organization or site. However, they are applying for a 365-day national service position full of numerous possibilities. Knowing what I'm assuming you're looking for, because it's what I would look for if I was interviewing applicants, you want people who possess certain motivations and skills and can really hit the ground running, although they still need some orientation and training. The 1 year of service goes by really quickly. So the questions you ask in the interview are essential to learn as much as you can from your applicants before making your selections. So we have a couple of activities for you. And the first, before we get into talking about the questions, we just want you to, and you can just share this in a couple of words, what do you feel is the purpose of an interview? Many of you, I'm sure, went through an interview to get your job, unless you were fortunate that someone just handed it to you and said, here, you're welcome. But it should be pretty obvious what the purpose of an interview is, but we'll take a minute to look in the chat to see what people are saying. I see some are just quickly saying, seeing if there's a fit between the job and the applicant, or the national service program and the applicant. To find it if it's a good fit, to make sure that the applicant understands what they're getting into, match up skills and needs. And I'm seeing a lot of people talking about finding a good fit, which I think kind of sums up everything we're talking about, because you really want the applicant to feel like they fit. You as the supervisor or project director or organization staff member also want to make sure you feel like it's a good fit. Understanding motivations, this is great. And I would encourage you, as you continue to share some of your thoughts about the purpose of an interview, to also share some of these thoughts to this question with the folks that are on your interview panel. Because although we all think, oh yeah, everyone knows what an interview is, your organization and site, just as we've seen in the chat, may have a slightly different variation on what you think of it. And as long as you can get everyone on your interview panel on the same page as to why you're doing the interview and the essence of it, that really, really takes it a long way. As you think about the applicants that you are looking at and those that have submitted applications to your project, interviews most likely are the first time that you substantially connect with your applicant. As you lead up to the interview, you've probably sent and responded to emails, and maybe you've even had a short phone call. But as many of you said in the chat, one of the primary purposes of interviews is really to take the time to learn more about the applicant, to see if they're a good fit, and to help them get to know more about your VISTA project. Wouldn't it be so great if our list of questions all had answers? Depending on how you conduct your interviews, you may only do them verbally, such as a telephone interview, or you may incorporate interviews that enable you to see each other, either on video or in-person interviews, or maybe you do a hybrid. This is an opportunity for you to carefully articulate your VISTA project and organization in ways that are engaging, but also gauge the applicant's interest in being part of that family. Be excited to talk with each individual. I know I'm very excited to be on this webinar because I love talking about interviews, and based on some of your responses, it looks like a lot of you are at least excited to have your applicants become members. Whether or not you're excited about the interview process is a whole nother story. But your tone in interview sets the tone of the whole scenario. So you really want to craft your interview questions in a way that helps you learn more about the applicant's reason for wanting to serve, learn about their interests, their skills, and how their experience can benefit your VISTA project. And speaking of experience, you ideally want your interview questions to be behavioral questions, questions that talk about their past experience and how that experience can relate to what they're hoping to do in their VISTA position. Even listening to the questions that the applicants ask you can really help you get a feel for what's on their mind and where they may succeed and need support. Your carefully crafted interview questions hopefully spark really good conversation, which gets them excited, energetic, enthusiastic between you and the applicant. Because after all of you involved in this process are investing your hard-earned and valuable time and energy into this process. So it's important that you try to enjoy it, and hopefully the applicant will as well. And then I want to briefly mention, The questions that you ask the applicant, as we're going to discuss in just a minute, really give the individual a sense of what is important to your VISTA project and what's important for this specific VISTA position. Certainly you could ask random questions or just questions that come off your mind, but if they're not specific or strategic, even the applicant might think, I don't know where this project is going, or have they really thought this through? So remember, interviews enable the individual to really gain some live, real-time information about the member activities that are in the VISTA assignment description, the expectations of their supervisor and the VISTA project, the overall goals of the project, their colleagues, peers, and more. So let's get into a little bit of a mock interview. We don't have the time, I wish we did, to do a full interview, but I really want us to look at a few questions and get you thinking about these questions as to whether or not these could be good questions for an interview or not. Interviews often start with a brief welcome, which includes typically an introduction of the interview panelists. Then you usually go into an overview of the interview process, the time frame, the logistics. But then oftentimes, as we know, the bulk of the interview is oftentimes you posing questions to the applicant and gathering information, and then having time for the applicant to ask questions for you to respond. Then you typically close out the interview with next steps. As we mentioned earlier, VISTA projects may design interviews however they want, whatever works for them. But where you focus the essence of your time is typically asking the applicant questions and listening to their answers. So we're going to start the mock interview, and we're going to skip the interview. We're going to skip the introductions and the overview step and segue straight into asking questions. I have the first question for you, Taylor. In this position, there are times where you will work on tasks by yourself and other times where you will be working on part of a team. How would you describe your work style independently and on a team? Well, thank you for that question. I work very well independently on my own as I have initiative and I can focus on what I'm doing. I also work very well on a team, no matter what my role is, in supporting others as well as leading others. I have been involved in previous situations where I've had to use one or the other or both, and I think I've done both pretty well. So we're going to ask you to use the chat now to look at the first question that we asked. And that question was, how would you describe your work style independently and on a team? And what we're asking you in the chat to answer is, does this question seem like a good question, a bad question, or do you have other comments you'd like to add? This is all part of a learning process because, as we know, the words you use in a webinar, we are in a webinar. The words you use in an interview can really make a difference as to how you interpret it and how the applicant interprets. So I see a lot of comments coming in saying, it seems like a pretty good question. It depends on the role. And that's true. It could depend on the role that the VISTA member will play, and it could depend on the role that the interviewer plays with the VISTA member. Some say you should ask the member to give an example. And a few more people saying it's a good question. Ask them to describe what they mean and how they'd work on a team versus individually. Great comments. Good for our organization. Okay. Thank you for those comments. And I agree with pretty much everything everyone said, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But I do want to be clear, and I should have mentioned this earlier, that I'm not telling you that you should definitely include or not include this question in your interviews. Again, you can decide all of that. My goal is really to give you information and help us think more critically about what information we're asking and what information you're seeking so you can craft the interview questions correctly. In my opinion, in my experience with interviews, almost everyone who I've heard answer a question like this will typically say that they either are or can be a strong worker independently or on a team. So personally, I don't find this question super helpful, but again, it may be useful for you, especially if you change it into more of a statement by explaining to the applicant the general culture and style of people at the VISTA project and organization. And as many of you said, then asking the applicant to explain how their experience would help them thrive in this new environment. With posing this question, the goal again is really to think, not only is this question good or bad for your project, but how can you tailor it and tweak it so that you really get the applicant to provide especially behavioral examples that speak to helping you understand more about their experience independently or on a team, and how that ties into their future VISTA project work. So that was great. So let's go on to the next interview question. Our next question focuses on your experience in relation to this specific VISTA position. We know it's important to us, and probably to you as well, that you and this VISTA position are right for each other. So Taylor, as you think about your work and volunteer experience, your skills, as well as your personal and professional interests, what makes you a good fit for this position? Well, my experience, I think, shows that I've accomplished a lot. I feel like I work well on my own and with others, and that I've managed volunteers and community members over the years. I'm truly passionate about helping others. I'm motivated to help this community thrive, and I really understand how to get things done. I'm interested in further developing myself and improving my community, and I really know what it's like to dedicate myself to a cause and work as hard as I can to succeed at it. So in this example, the question that we just asked essentially was, what makes you a good fit for this position? Again, in the chat, feel free to type if this question is helpful or not, and then why or why not. I truly appreciate a lot of the detail many of you are providing in the chat, and I would encourage you to look at some of these and use these in your project, because some of the feedback and comments you're giving on these questions can really, really be helpful to others who are new to the interviewing process, or maybe they've been interviewing for years but want a different way to think about it. So again, this question is, what makes you a good fit for this position? And so I see a couple of comments coming in the chat. Some like this question because it really gives the VISTA applicant an opportunity to talk about themselves in somewhat of a vague way, but in a way that was really passionate to that applicant. It's helpful because it's open-ended, some saying it's not a good question. And again, if you're willing to, feel free to type why or why not. I see some people recommending revise it to see if they can talk more specifically about experiences that would be a good fit, helping them to understand their role. Another recommendation was that it's a good question, but encourage the members specifically to talk about why their experience helps them to fit this position. Some people might interpret this as any position, but helping the applicant think, for this specific VISTA position, what makes you a good fit and why are you the person we should hire and select? These are great comments. I see a few more coming in, some more saying it's helpful. I think it gears the applicant to align their experience and interest with the actual VISTA assignment description. On the opposing side, it's not a great question because there is not enough information about the role. And this is one of the things you'll come into contact with, especially as you look at interview questions that you have listed or that maybe you want to use for your VISTA project, is how specific do you want the question to be to that role? And then I'll read one more. Not a good question unless this is a re-applicant, someone coming back for a second or third time. They don't necessarily know what the experience will be. And that's true. If you haven't given them some information about the VISTA project, or if you assume that they know what they're getting into, it may or may not be helpful to ask a question like this. So let's look at the essence of the interview question. Much of what you all are currently saying in the chat responses really resonates with me. I agree with many of you that I think this question is effective and does get right to the point of what you're seeking, but I also agree that it can be tweaked depending on how specific you want to get. Many of you mentioned this question is great, but it's a little bit vague and the person may not have enough context to really know if they're a good fit for this position. So again, this comes in where you and your VISTA project may want to decide, if you do ask this question, is it a question maybe you want to ask towards the end of the interview, because maybe before that you've interspersed a few bits of information about the VISTA project in the organization so that they have more time to think about, do they think they'd be a good fit? Or you may decide not to use this question at all and come up with other questions, but it really gets you to think about the wording, the phrasing, and the order of the question. And again, you want the applicant to reflect on what they bring to the position if they really think it's the right decision based on how they would fit in. So simply, you're taking time to really look at the essence of the interview question in terms of what it's literally asking, and this is really important, what you hope to do with the answer. It's all great to have a great interview question, but if you don't have an idea of how the answer could help your project make the determination, or on your side, how you think the applicant could fit in with your project, you might want to go back and tweak the interview questions just a little bit. And I'll close with this question by saying, one other way to think about it, and the way some projects will ask a question similar to this, is they may ask, why should we hire you? It kind of has a similar mindset because you're really intentionally leaving it extremely open-ended, asking the applicant, what can you tell us that will make us want to select you for this VISTA position? So there's thousands of ways you could phrase it. And again, it just depends on how you want to word it. But generally, there are a lot of people who will use either this question or a question similar to it intentionally to give the applicant a little bit more broad strokes to give feedback to the VISTA project. So great work on that one. Next question. We know that sometimes so many elements, factors, or people are involved in introducing you to VISTA and motivating you to want to serve. So Taylor, I know that you just applied to our project. Our question is, what drew you to this position? Why did you apply for this position? Well, I'll admit that I don't really have any family members or close friends who have served in AmeriCorps, but if I remember, I was attracted to the position because of its focus on service and really because of the specific activities around building and improving community. That really resonates with me. This position is special because I'm close with the community where I grew up. And when I heard about the VISTA position, I knew how important it was to feel part of and be part of that sense of community. I've always involved in some kind of service. And because I heard about AmeriCorps from a previous boss, I just knew that this was something I was committed to do. I just felt like I needed to apply. So this is another question we'd like to ask. And again, these are questions that you may already have in your VISTA project, you may want to add, or you may want to think about something else. But when we asked Taylor this question, what drew you to this position? How do you feel about this question? And I'll cheat a little bit and say, as you're typing in the chat, I can see pros and cons to this position. I've definitely been part of interviews where this question has been asked, and including questions for volunteers like AmeriCorps members. And it's a powerful question. It's one of those that you really want to think about. Why are you asking this question? What do you hope to get from the question? And I will also say it's one of those questions you want to ask yourself, given that I'm going to go out on a limb and say most questions for interviews, or most interviews, typically are anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. Certainly it could be longer, could be shorter, but let's say on average they're an hour. You likely only have time for a certain number of questions, given that you have to do introductions, you want the applicant to ask you questions as well. So I'm not saying you should or should not ask this question. I just want us to think about, if you do ask this question, what's the purpose? And if you still want to ask the question, but not in an interview, maybe there's a way you can get the information outside of an interview so you don't tie up one of the questions with this interview question. And I see some of you are saying it's a decent question, but it's better perhaps to ask what sets this opening apart from others. That makes a lot of sense to me. Some people saying it's an okay question, but maybe there's a better way to word this. And certainly that's the case. And I would say with all the interview questions you have before, and we'll get into this in a little bit, before you actually release them and say, these are the official interview questions, take time yourself and have a few other people look at them and think, is this really the way we want to ask this question? Does it make sense? Is it understandable? And again, what do we hope to get from the answer to this question? And I see another comment is, if their motivation is strong, they'll be more likely to stay committed to service and not terminate their service early when things get difficult. And that very much goes to oftentimes what drew them to this position. And again, maybe you asked this question as part of the interview, Maybe it's a question you put in an email to get them just thinking and motivated. It's a useful question, especially because a lot of projects want to know, how did you hear about us, and how did you find us, and why were you encouraged to apply? But again, since every VISTA project is different, there's no official set of interview questions from the VISTA program that you have to ask. It really is just a reflective time to think about, is this a question you want to ask in an interview? And if so, how do you want to word it? Because motivation, as we all know, including for us in our current positions, is very, very important. So again, as we look at the applicant's motivation, we just want to mention that, as I mentioned, this question is powerful, and it really focuses on the heart of why the member cares about service, and specifically this VISTA position at your VISTA project. Tapping into their motivation is absolutely critical, and whether you do that through this question or some other questions, you really want to explore the applicant's motivation to serve, as well as their goals for service, which talks about how they heard about the position, what attracted them, what they hope to get out of it, and maybe even what their future goals are after the VISTA position. That kind of ties into the interviews and post-interviews. So nice work with that one. And we just have one more interview question for you to take a look at. So the final question is this. So Taylor, we have just one more question for you. We'd like you to think about a situation in which you were working on a project or an activity and you encountered a problem. Take a minute to describe the situation, the problem, and what happened. Okay, well, it may take me a few seconds to think of something, as I have a few thoughts on my mind. I've certainly had a lot of experience, and okay, well, here's one. Here's an example I can give you. A couple of years ago, when I worked as a volunteer coordinator at an art museum, I was responsible for recruiting, organizing, and training volunteers. The volunteers would greet visitors, they'd give tours, answer questions, and even though I, as a volunteer coordinator, would give the volunteers a thorough orientation, I noticed a problem that one of the volunteers would start doing their work, and then they would drift off and gather in a group to chat and socialize instead of standing at their positions to welcome visitors. And it became a huge problem because many visitors came in, didn't know where to go, didn't receive the hospitality they deserved. Most of them eventually figured it out on their own, or they waited in line to talk to one of the other two volunteers who were doing their job, but it was frustrating to see that one volunteer wasn't doing what they were supposed to do. So my last chat question in terms of interview questions in this scenario is, what are your thoughts about this question? And again, the question, as you can see it on the screen, is think about a situation in which you were working on a project and you encountered a problem. What was the situation, the problem, and what happened? I'm guessing many of you have either been part of interviews or have this or a similar question in your interviews as you get them to think about problems, scenarios, challenges. It's not necessarily that you want to steer the conversation negative, but you do want to think, some of you may already have VISTA members, some of you will have VISTA members. They're likely to encounter some problem in the future, and it's always good to see how someone looked at a problem in the past. And I'm seeing a variety of responses. Some say it's a good question. I like to hear how they react to things going wrong. I like to ask about a time they've been overwhelmed and what they've done in those circumstances. A few other comments are on the opposing side, saying the question's a little bit too vague, talks more about the flaws of other coworkers. And if you really want to look at how an employee will react, maybe give them a pre-made scenario, which certainly can be done and can be very effective, especially if it's a realistic, real-life pre-made scenario that you later tell them, oh, that scenario is actually something that often occurs at our VISTA project, or could occur, or has occurred. I'll add that sometimes just adding what happened is not bad, but what did you do to solve the problem? Absolutely, thank you for that comment. Again, the question on the screen specifically asks the applicant, what was the situation, what was the problem, and what happened? And although I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people saying there are pros and cons to this question, the problem is if you just ask what happened, some applicants might interpret that as, okay, here's how I solved the problem. But in the example I gave where Taylor just gave a response, Taylor didn't say anything about what the solution was. Taylor just talked about what the problem was and why it was frustrating. So many of you are hitting the nail right on the head that in a question like this, if you do ask a question like this, it does seem to make sense to either do what someone said earlier about giving a pre-made situation with a specific problem, or it helps to specifically ask whatever the problem was. And there's different ways of doing it. You can ask, how did you solve the problem? You can ask, what role did you have in solving the problem? How were you involved in solving the problem? Ultimately, it's not necessarily the problem that you care about. You want to know, how did they solve the problem, or how did they work with someone? Because as a VISTA member, if and when they encounter problems, they will likely need to come to you as a supervisor or someone, and you want to just make sure that they're able to address and at least analyze the problem and start towards a solution. So thank you. This is great. I can see the wheels turning in many of us. And it can be common to ask questions, to talk about a problem they encountered, a negative situation. And as many of you said, you don't want to steer the conversation negative. But I'm guessing that what you really want to know is, what was the applicant's role in the situation? How did they solve it? And did they solve it on their own? Did they get help? Did they ask their supervisor? What was their next step? More than just what happened, because what happened, as many of you said, is a little bit too vague. And if they don't mention any of those details, well, that's up to them, but at least you're giving them a question specifically helping them focus on what the problem was, what the solution was, and how they were involved in it. So great work with those questions. Some of them were tricky, and the thoughts and comments that you all provided were absolutely key, because it really helps us to think about, these are some real life questions that are asked in interviews, and whether or not they could apply to your VISTA project. So we're going to briefly segue now into some questions that you definitely should avoid, and some that you probably want to avoid. And this continues from the conversation we've been having earlier, because many of you have already talked about some questions that you would avoid, or you would at least tweak to make better for your VISTA project. So first, we're going to look at right versus wrong. When you think about what questions are the right questions to ask, and again, the right questions may vary from project to project, because every project has its own goals and aims for their VISTA members. You really should also at least consider what questions are the wrong questions to ask and why, and what does wrong mean for your project. So think about what questions are not worded well, as some of the ones we talked about earlier, or which questions will really not help the applicant clearly be able to explain why they should be selected for the position. You absolutely, and I won't say that word again, but just trust me that I mean it, want to avoid using any questions that are illegal and inappropriate to ask in an interview. And again, if you want more detail, I'll send you a resource document. There's also more information online. But for example, I've been involved in some interviews where the applicant will first bring up questions about, or bring up comments about having a child or their religion. And that's certainly welcome if they want to bring that up. But if they do bring it up first, don't ask questions or solicit more information about things like marital status, age, health, race, ethnicity, etc. It really seems obvious, but you want to avoid the actual and perceived discrimination based on protected factors. So really the guidance I can give you is, if they bring it up, kind of listen to what they say and try to focus the conversation back on the questions you're trying to ask them, because you don't want to get in trouble by following up on a question that may seem like it could have illegal perceptions. You also want to, as we talked about earlier, try to avoid asking questions that simply just don't make sense, or questions that seem really confusing. And again, that goes back to the way we were talking about, how do you word a question so that it's pretty obvious what you're asking. So you want to stay away from asking questions that may make the interview panel wonder, why are we asking this question in the first place? Make your questions clear to the applicant and explain your interview panel why each question is important. You also want to avoid asking several questions that are unrelated to your task at hand to determine if the applicant would be well suited for the position. What we mean is that You can ask a random or fun question such as, if you could be any food, what would you be and why? But you probably want to keep those questions to a minimum and really consider, are you just asking them to break the ice and have some fun? Or are you trying to make the applicant feel at ease and really get the applicant's understanding of how they would answer that question in relation to other questions connected to the VISTA project? A couple more things I'll give you is the question on the screen, do you think that your experience will help you in this position? Certainly, many of you talked about this earlier, you can read the applicant's resume and the AmeriCorps member application, and you can easily learn more about their experience. So the idea of this question is a good one in concept, but the format is not necessarily the best because this one is phrased simply as a yes or no question. Generally, when possible, try to avoid simple yes or no questions because you really want them to describe their experience. And you can improve this question simply by adding why or why not at the end to help them add more to the information they give you. When you're looking to recruit VISTA members and VISTA applicants, sometimes you may be encouraged to ask a question like, can you describe a time when you experienced conflict on a task or a team? Because you know that that VISTA member will likely be working with a team at some point, whether it's a team of volunteers, a team of staff. Again, the intent of this statement is a good one, as you want to see how the applicant has dealt with past situations, challenging problems. But more importantly, as we talked about earlier, you really want to know how, if at all, the applicant worked to overcome the situation and what role they had in dissolving the conflict and solving the problem. So if you're going to ask an interview question like this to a VISTA applicant, you may want to slightly adjust the wording to say something like, tell us about a time when you were instrumental in solving a problem. It could be on a project you or someone else managed, but tell us what happened and how specifically did you work to overcome it and what role you had in the solution. We already mentioned that each VISTA project approaches interviewing applicants differently. So let's take a look at a couple of questions you may want to consider. Generally, you want to ask questions that help you learn about the applicant's work and volunteer experience. Again, behavioral questions based on what they've done and what they hope to do in the future, and how that connects to the VISTA position. Obviously, anyone starting a new position, including VISTA members, will need an orientation and some training, but VISTA projects oftentimes want to know about their experience so they can tie it into the VISTA assignment description and think about how that experience could be helpful. For example, you may have a VISTA position that deals with grant writing, so you may be looking for someone who has experience in writing grants. So questions relating to experience are absolutely important. Next, as you explore this individual and their interest in serving, I would recommend considering asking questions about their work style and work ethic, especially if the VISTA member will be working on a team and with other people. But while you ask that question, also give them some information about the general work ethic of the organization, because that really helps them not understand you're just asking the specific question, but you're also helping them understand, here's generally how people work in the organization. Here's generally how our VISTA project staff get along. You really want to set up the applicant for success, and you can do that by asking questions like this. Of course, I think we all know in an ideal situation, it's great to ask questions that help us, whether directly or indirectly, understand a little bit about the applicant's personality. We know that your definition of a good fit may also relate to the applicant's personality in terms of how they work and relate to others, how they get along. So again, offer statements to which the applicant can respond, that get them talking about examples of how their personality has fit in their previous experience. And so many individuals are motivated to serve with AmeriCorps through the VISTA program. That motivation and inspiration can carry the individual throughout their year of service. So it's not a bad idea to ask a question, or maybe even two, to have them tell you about why they were interested. But I would add, if you do that, maybe also encourage them to tell you not just why they're interested, but what got them excited about the position and what they themselves will bring, what what they will add to your VISTA project. Again, it kind of goes back to that question of why should we hire you? The VAD, the VISTA assignment description, really drives a member's service. So if and when possible, think about having at least one question focused on the VISTA assignment description activities. Again, by now you may have already given the applicant their VAD, which I would recommend, but you may not have, but at least it gets the position and the interview focused more on tangibles and what they'll actually be doing, so you can find out, does this member seem like they can accomplish these activities? Do they understand it? Are they ready to serve with our VISTA project? And you also want to encourage more dialogue and conversation, because you want to hear about the applicant's experience, expertise, skills, even stories they may tell you. Be engaging and asking questions. Let the applicant know that this really is the time for both of you to get to know more about each other and the VISTA position. If you find out that the applicant is providing very short responses and you don't feel it gives enough of an answer, ask them to elaborate, or as was mentioned earlier, maybe give them an example of what you're looking for and ask them to reply to that example. Again, you want conversation going. So now that you have an idea of some things to consider when creating your interview questions, I'm going to highlight just a few examples of actual interview questions that could be beneficial to you and your project as you connect with applicants. So one question you may want to consider is, why AmeriCorps VISTA and why now? The reasons for asking this question should be self-explanatory. And again, you may decide to ask this outside the interview if you want to leave the interview for more specific questions about their experience. But this question really helps you learn about their motivations and interests. Another question, how do you feel that your past work and volunteer experience will help you succeed as an AmeriCorps member with the VISTA program? I won't go into detail about this question because many of you already highlighted the points of this in the chat, just about how important it is to get them thinking about their past experience and how it relates to their current and near future experience as a VISTA member. Another question, tell us about a time when you were managing a project and encountered a major challenge. What was the challenge and how did you handle it? How were you involved in the solution? We talked about this earlier as well. Really getting them to think about the solution, and you as the interviewer understanding and listening for what steps they took, who was involved, and what role the VISTA member had. I'll quickly say, sometimes this question can be sidetracked because sometimes you'll hear an applicant talk about the problem and how the problem was solved, but they may not specifically say what their role is it, and it's perfectly fine to not push back, but to ask a question to say, oh, I hear you talk about the problem and these people were involved, but what was your role in it and how did you specifically handle it? Because that's really what you want to know. If they just tell you someone else handled it, that's great, but there's something missing. And then one more question I'll give you is, well, it's really a statement. We are looking for someone who can work independently and take control of projects, as well as who works well with others through teamwork. So tell us more about your work style. And again, as has mentioned earlier, some people like to question like this, some didn't, because it is vague intentionally, but it does at least allow the member or the applicant to open up about how they like to work independently and with others. So just keep these types of questions in mind as you look at your interview questions and as you maybe create ones of your own. Very quickly summarizing some of this information gives you this quick snapshot. Generally, as we mentioned, the right questions to ask are usually, at least for the most part, open-ended and prompt dialogue. They focus the applicant's experience on how it relates to the VISTA position. And the questions really help you learn about the applicant's personality in relation to the upcoming VISTA assignment description activities. And they also explore the applicant's work ethic. You want to avoid the wrong questions, and those are usually simple yes or no questions because they don't give you any substantial information. You absolutely want to avoid asking any questions that are illegal or perceived to be illegal or discriminatory. Avoid asking questions that are unclear or confusing. And just because they really don't help you determine if the applicant will be a good fit, and they don't understand the question, and then it just wastes too much time in the interview to try to explain it and go through all those details. One final chat question for you before we give you a little bit more information and wrap up and answer your questions. Go ahead and use the chat now to type any recommendations you have regarding interview questions. And I'll say the information you type in the chat, although it's interesting to me, it's really for you. So share any suggestions or recommendations you have that other supervisors, sponsors, anyone else on this session can really benefit from. What recommendations do you have regarding specifically interview questions? That'll help. I know earlier some people said this is their first time interviewing, and some people said they've been doing this for a while, but looking for new ways to try things. So as we continue, just take a look at what recommendations, if any, you have regarding interview questions, and feel free to type in links to any resources or other information that you want to share with others. While you do that, we're going to pause for just about 1.5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes. And we're going to check in on some of the key concepts that we reviewed. So in a couple of seconds, you'll see a poll appear on your screen, and no rush, we'll give you a little bit of time to do it. But you'll see a poll appear on your screen, and it's a quick knowledge check. We're asking you to answer one question. Hopefully it should be something you can answer quickly. The question is, which of these is the most effective interview question to ask applicants? And you'll see the 4 options. Tell us about a time when you encountered a problem. Describe your work style independently and with others. What makes you a good fit for this position? What drew you to this position? We'll play music for about 45 seconds while you complete the poll and respond to the chat, and we'll come back to give you a few resources and answer some questions. We'll give you a couple more seconds to fill out the poll. I know several of you are working on it diligently, and we just have a couple of more things to go over. So take about 10 more seconds if you're working on the poll, and just select which answer you think is the correct answer. If you don't have access to the poll, feel free to type it in the chat, but I believe most people should have access to the poll. And we will go ahead and close the poll, and we will look at the answer. So even though all these questions could be good and can be effective, based on the information that we have, the most effective, at least based on these 4 questions, is C. What makes you a good fit for this position? Now, again, I'll say, obviously, every project may have their own definition of what they think is the best for them. But based on these questions, the first one, again, tell us about a time when you encountered a problem. It doesn't ask how you resolved it, so the answer may not be extremely helpful. The second one, describe your work style independently and with others. That can be helpful, but it's not necessarily as effective in terms of learning all about the member's experience. It just focuses on their work style. And then again, what drew you to this position? It's great to know why they applied and how they heard about it, but that doesn't necessarily help you determine their skills per se. Whereas what makes you a good fit for this position? Yes, it's broad, which I know some people didn't like, but it at least isn't able to include the wide variety of answers. So thank you for participating in that short little poll. While we move on to recommendations and resources, I will ask you if you have any questions, type them in the chat. I know there's a few that came in early we'll try to get to, so any questions, type them in the chat. We'll start looking at some tips for success. Amidst all the questions you have, we're going to give you a couple of tips to help you on your way. So I think we have 5 tips we're going to give you. The first is think about what you really need to know and want to know in your interviews to help decide if they will be a good fit for the position. Next, brainstorm potential interview questions. You may already have questions written, and if you do, I would ask you to reflect on them and think about, are those the right questions? Write down all the suggestions you have, even ones you think that might be ridiculous, but then go ahead and cross out any questions that are illegal or bad or just don't make sense, and keep the good ones and then narrow it down from there. Third, once you have your questions drafted, really make sure you give them to at least 1 or 2 other people to review and give you feedback. It's really helpful to have a second or third set of eyes from people who know about your VISTA project and really help you think about what's best for your applicants. Just like we did, although yours is probably going to be more fleshed out, I would recommend conducting a mock interview and use staff or volunteers as the applicant. You can even record the mock interview if you want, but it really gives you a chance to put those questions to real use before you unveil them to all of your applicants. So you can then take a look back and say, oh yeah, that question didn't really make sense, or that's a really good question. We should make sure to ask that in an interview. And then last but not least, at least 1 day before the interview, make sure you share the interview questions with your interview panel. I know it seemed like, oh, of course we would do that, but it never fails. You want your interview panel to know what the questions are and have a little context as to why you're asking them, just because it really helps make the interview more efficient and more effective. I strongly recommend that you log into the VISTA campus and explore existing resources on member recruitment, which of course includes interviewing. And this learning path is where the recording for this session will be housed. You can simply follow the instructions to access the member recruitment learning path and take advantage of other recorded webinars and information to help you in your very important role of recruiting VISTA members. And if you haven't yet been there, please take a minute to go to the VISTA Connect page. It's a great opportunity to connect and collaborate with other supervisors. There's already information and people posting, asking for responses and comments. And I posted I'm losing my mind. I posted a comment there last week regarding interviewing that you can respond to and add your resources. So take a look at that. As you can see on the screen, we're showing you a screenshot of the Supervisors Group, specifically on VISTA Connect, where you can share your knowledge, resources, questions, and more. And specifically on this topic of interviews, as I mentioned, here's a snapshot of one of the comments I put in there regarding interviews. So when you have a minute, take time just to share, not for me, but for each other. Connect with each other, share resources. Why reinvent the wheel when we've had so many years of VISTA projects recruiting that now you can actually benefit from research and information that other projects have. So we covered a lot in our short period of time. And as I said, I love interviewing, so I could talk about it for days. We talked about planning ahead in terms of drafting your interview questions. We went through a mock interview, briefly looking at 4 questions and responses that may or may not be good for interviews. We discussed questions to avoid in an interview, questions to consider, and then provided some recommendations as we move forward to doing more interviews. So next, we're going to ask you to take just a couple of minutes, either now or shortly after the session, to complete a session evaluation. It's a pretty quick evaluation, but we love to evaluate this specific session, but also look at what information you're interested in for future sessions. So thank you in advance for your feedback. We appreciate all the work that you do, of course. We couldn't do it without you. And we greatly appreciate your feedback on sessions like this so we can provide more sessions that are hopefully meaningful, relevant, and useful for you. Very briefly, next month, 4 weeks from today, our second webinar and interviews, this one's specifically on sharing the right details. And I'll briefly say, today we talked about asking the right questions, which is a huge part of an interview, but also in an interview, you have time to share details about the project, about the position, about the culture of the organization. It's a two-way conversation. So next month, we're going to talk about How do you share the right details? What information should you share? What can you fit into an interview to really help the applicant also think about, is this really a good fit for me or not? That'll be on Tuesday, May 17th, 2 o'clock Eastern. You can go to the VISTA campus calendar, click on May 17th date, and register for the webinar if you'd like to attend. So now we have time for a couple of questions. In scrolling back in the chat, one of the questions I saw was relating to, we talked about avoiding illegal questions, and someone asked, can we ask if there's anything that would prohibit you from doing this job? You certainly can ask a question to the applicants, such as, is there anything we should know that would prohibit you or prevent you from doing this job? Well, it's not a job, but we know what you mean. Yes, you can ask that question, but I would say a couple of things. One, make sure if you do ask that question, make sure you ask it to everyone. You don't want it to just randomly come up if an applicant brings up a specific personal situation and then you only ask that applicant. So yes, you can certainly ask a general question like that. Secondly, I would say, if you do ask a question like that, remember, someone else pointed this out earlier. At this stage, especially if it's their first interview, some projects do 1, some do 2 or 3. The applicant may not necessarily know all there is to know about doing this position. So if you ask, is there anything that would prohibit you from doing this position? They may say no, or they may say, I don't know because I'm still learning about the position. So if you do ask that, you might want to either ask it towards the end of the interview or make sure that during the interview, you provide a little bit more detail so the applicant can understand what the terms and conditions are, the fact that it's 365 days, so that they're actually responding to your question. So let's see, a few other questions, and I apologize if they're not in order. I'm scrolling through, I see a couple of them. Someone brought up asking what experience and plans the applicant has for living on a tight budget. Do you recommend that as a question? I have my own personal thoughts on that, which I will, well, I'll say it's tough. I don't think I would ask that in an interview question, but I think you do have to squeeze it in somewhere, whether it's out of a question or maybe it's part of next month's webinar when we talk about sharing the right details, and that before the interview, maybe you share information with the applicant about, here's what the living allowance in our county is, and here's what the average cost of living is. So that by the time you get to the interview, if you ask that question, at least they'd have more context and more information to say, oh yeah, I thought about it and I can or cannot make this work. Or if you don't ask the question, at least you're still helping them decide if they can make it financially work. Because what you don't want to happen is for them to start the position and then realize what the cost of living is and then say, I can't make this work. So whether you ask a question like, what plans you have for living on a tight budget, just make sure somewhere before or during the interview, you at least let them know what living is like, and maybe even have a current or former VISTA member provide some details to help them understand that. Then another question, let me see, I missed one. Oh, since capacity building is key to VISTA service, I'd like to ask them to share what skills or experience they have that will create sustainable projects or operations. Are there other ways to get applicants to provide information about the skills they have to do capacity building work? Yes, and I know we're out of time. So before I answer that, I'll say, feel free to email me if you have other questions. I will email you more details tomorrow. But quickly to answer this question, I would say one way I think is in the interview, applicants may not fully know what capacity building is. So I think part of it is taking 2 or 3 sentences to explain what capacity building is, give them an example, and then say, could you talk about any experience you have related to this type of service or work? That way you're helping them before asking them a question that they may not know the answer to. So again, if you have additional questions, please feel free to email me. I will send you the recording and corresponding resources. Thank you so much to everyone who was part of this webinar, including Dylan and Mike, managing Zoom technology, Barbara, my editor and support team, and thank you to you for all the work and the important service you do, managing our VISTA members, recruiting them, and just helping them have a successful year of service. This concludes today's webinar. Have a great day.